He was given nothing but a key to a rusty metal shed on a forgotten piece of land. What he built there would save his life. If you have ever heard a door close behind you and known with absolute certainty that it would never open again, then you already understand the beginning of this story. It is not a sound you forget. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, mechanical, final. The click of a lock engaging. The soft exhale of a hydraulic hinge. And then silence. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses against your chest and says very clearly, you are on your own now. Stay with me on this one. And if this story finds you the way it found me, you might want to subscribe because what happened next is something I still cannot fully explain. The door to the Northridge group home for boys closed at 9 o'clock in the morning on Rowan Mercer's 18th birthday. October the 7th, a Tuesday. The sky was the color of old concrete, flat and low and heavy, pressing down on the city like a lid. The trees along the sidewalk had already begun to turn their leaves, going from green to rust in that slow, tired way that always made autumn feel less like a season and more like a surrender. Rowan stood on the front steps with a duffel bag over his right shoulder. It was army green, fraying at the strap, and it held everything he owned in this world. 3 changes of clothes, none of them warm enough for what was coming. A toothbrush with bent bristles. A worn paperback copy of a book he had read so many times the spine had gone white and the pages had softened to the texture of cloth, and a thin manila folder containing the documents that declared him, as of today, a legal adult. Free, emancipated, released from the custody of the state. The words sounded like freedom. They felt like falling. He did not look back at the building. There was no reason to. Northridge was not the kind of place you looked back at. It was a long 2-story brick structure with narrow windows and fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just low enough to burrow into your skull and stay there. The walls were beige. The floors were beige. The counselors wore expressions that matched. Everything about it was designed to be temporary, to hold you until you were old enough to be someone else's problem, or better yet, no one's problem at all. Rowan had arrived at Northridge when he was 14, transferred from a smaller facility downstate that had lost its funding. Before that, there had been 2 other homes, and before those, a series of foster placements that blurred together in his memory like watercolor left in the rain. He had been in the system since he was 6 years old, 12 years. He had learned in that time the single most important skill the system teaches you: how to become invisible. How to sit in a room full of people and take up no space. How to move through hallways without making a sound. How to swallow every feeling you have until your insides are smooth and empty, and nothing can hurt you because there is nothing left to hurt. He was good at it. He was the best. But standing on those steps with the October wind cutting through his thin hoodie and the city noise rising around him like a tide, he realized that invisibility has a cost. When no one sees you, no one catches you when you fall. And right now, standing at the edge of 18 with no money, no family, no plan, and no place to go, Rowan Mercer was falling. His only instruction was a slip of paper the house supervisor had handed him that morning, along with a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long, the kind of handshake that substitutes for all the things people cannot bring themselves to say. On the paper was an address, a downtown office building, a name, Mr. Whitfield, and a time, 11 o'clock. He walked. He walked because he did not have the $1.75 for the bus. He walked because walking was something he could do, something that required no permission, no paperwork, no approval from anyone. The city moved around him in its usual frantic rhythm, taxis honking, people rushing, the smell of coffee and exhaust, and wet pavement rising from the streets. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone had a purpose. Rowan moved among them like a ghost, a thin figure in a gray hoodie, his face pale, his eyes the color of lake water in winter, and no one, not a single person, looked at him twice. The office building was glass and steel, 14 stories of corporate indifference. The lobby was all marble and silence. The elevator was polished brass, and in its distorted reflection, Rowan saw a stranger staring back at him. A young man with hollow cheeks and a jaw that was still deciding what shape it wanted to be. Eyes that were too old for the face they lived in. Hands that had never built anything, never held anything worth keeping. He looked away. Mr. Whitfield's office was on the 14th floor. The reception area smelled of old paper and lemon furniture polish. The receptionist, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, glanced up when he said his name, then glanced down again, her expression unchanged. He might as well have told her he was the wind. He waited on a leather chair that was too soft, sinking into it in a way that made him feel smaller than he already was. The clock on the wall ticked with a precision that felt almost cruel each second, a reminder that time was now his problem, his to fill, his to waste, his to survive. At 11:15, the inner door opened and a man appeared. Mr. Whitfield was in his late 60s with a thick head of silver hair combed back from a broad, deeply lined forehead. He wore a tweed jacket with patches on the elbows and a tie that might have been fashionable in a decade Rowan had not been alive for. His eyes were brown and tired, the eyes of a man who had spent a career watching the system process people like grain through a mill and who had long ago stopped being surprised by what came out the other end. He did not smile. He did not offer a handshake. He simply looked at Rowan for a long moment as if measuring something only he could see, and then nodded once and said, "Come in." The office was small and cluttered. File cabinets lined the walls, their drawers slightly ajar, as if exhausted from holding so many stories. On the white mahogany desk sat a cardboard box, small ordinary, held together with yellowing tape. It could have contained anything. It could have contained nothing. Whitfield sat down heavily, the chair creaking under him, and gestured for Rowan to sit. He folded his hands on the desk. His fingers were thick, the knuckles swollen with age, and he pressed them together with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words. "Rowan," he said, "happy birthday." Nobody had said that to him, not the supervisor, not the other boys at North Ridge, not a single person on the street during his 2-mile walk. The words hit him with unexpected force, not because they were warm, but because they were honest. There was no cheer in Whitfield's voice, only acknowledgement. "Today you are 18. Today everything changes. Happy birthday." This box, Whitfield continued sliding it forward with both hands, is what was left in trust for you by your grandfather. Henry Mercer. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Rowan knew the name. He had seen it in his file, a ghost in the footnotes of his own history. Henry Mercer, paternal grandfather, deceased, no further information available. He was a name without a face, a branch on a family tree that had been cut down before Rowan could ever climb it. "I was told there was nothing," Rowan said. His voice came out rough, unused. He could not remember the last time he had spoken in a room this quiet. Whitfield nodded slowly. "Financially, that is more or less true. After your parents passed, your grandfather spent most of what he had settling their affairs and making arrangements for you before his own health failed. There is no bank account, no stocks, no savings. The state stipend that covered your care at North Ridge ends today." He paused and let the weight of that settle. "What is in this box," Whitfield said, "is your entire inheritance. And from what I can see, it is your only option." Rowan pulled the box closer. It was lighter than it looked and heavier than it should have been. The tape cracked under his thumbnail, the sound sharp in the quiet office, and he lifted the flaps. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings, were 3 items. A large iron key, black with age, heavy enough to feel its weight shift in the box as he tilted it. A thick manila envelope, sealed and official. And a smaller envelope, white with a single word written on it in faint, spidery handwriting. Rowan. He stared at his own name in a dead man's hand. The letters were shaky but deliberate, each one pressed into the paper with the careful force of someone who knew this might be the last thing they ever wrote. The large envelope, Whitfield said, watching him carefully, contains the deed to a piece of property. 5 acres in the Cascade foothills, about 3 hours east of here. It was your grandfather's. The small envelope is a personal letter from him. He left explicit instructions that I was to give it to you on your 18th birthday, and only after I had explained the full situation. Whitfield slid another paper across the desk. A tax bill. The numbers on it were printed in stark black ink, and they hit Rowan like a fist to the stomach. 2 years of delinquent property taxes. A total that might as well have been $1 million to a boy with empty pockets. And a deadline, 90 days. Pay in full or the county seizes the land and sells it at auction. The key, Whitfield said, is for the only structure on the property. According to county records, it is a Quonset hut, a corrugated steel shelter. basically a shed. Rowan sat very still. He looked at the key. He looked at the tax bill. He looked at the small envelope with his name on it, and he felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement, deep and slow, the kind that precedes either an earthquake or a collapse. A shed, he repeated. Whitfield leaned back. His chair groaned. I have to be honest with you, Rowan. There is a development company, Orion Land Corporation, that has been acquiring property in that area for a large-scale resort project. They have made a standing offer for your grandfather's parcel. It is a significant amount of money, enough for an apartment, a vehicle, a genuine start. He opened a drawer and placed a business card on the desk. It was thick cream-colored with a stylized green leaf logo that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never touched a real leaf in their life. Sell it, Whitfield said. His voice was quiet but firm. Take the money. Get yourself an apartment. Enroll in community college. Build a life. There is nothing for you out there in those hills. Nothing but trees and mud and silence. Rowan picked up the iron key. It was cold, almost shockingly so, as if it had been stored somewhere deep underground. The metal was rough with age, pitted, and dark, and it had a weight to it that felt deliberate, like it was meant to be held, meant to remind you that it opened something real. He put everything back in the box. The deed, the tax bill, the business card, the key, and the small white envelope he had not yet opened. As he stood to leave, Whitfield said something that stopped him at the door. The old lawyer's voice had changed. The professional composure had cracked just slightly, just enough to let something human bleed through. Rowan, he turned. Your grandfather was the only client in 30 years of practice who ever kept me up at night. Whitfield paused, his eyes steady and unreadable. Be careful with what he did not write down. The words hung in the air between them. Rowan did not ask what they meant. He was not sure he wanted to know. He walked out of the office, through the silent reception area, past the woman who still did not look up into the elevator down 14 floors, and out onto the street where the city was still moving, still breathing, still completely indifferent to the fact that an 18-year-old boy was carrying his entire future in a cardboard box. He did not read the letter that night. He was not ready. The thought of hearing a dead man's voice, of opening a door into a past he had never been allowed to enter, felt too large, too dangerous for the hollow space inside his chest. Instead, he sat on a bench in the Greyhound station, the city lights smeared across the dirty glass, the hum of engines and the garbled intercom forming a kind of mechanical lullaby. He kept one hand in his pocket wrapped around the key. The metal warmed slowly against his palm, and it was the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving at the edges. He bought the bus ticket the next morning. It cost him almost everything he had left. The bus headed east, climbing out of the city in low gear, and Rowan watched through the smudged window as the world transformed. The concrete and glass fell away. The billboards thinned. The sky widened. Suburbs gave way to farmland, flat and brown under the October sky. And then the farmland gave way to forests, thick and dark and endless, the trees climbing the hills in dense ranks like an army waiting for orders. The other passengers were quiet. Working people, most of them. Lined faces and calloused hands, and the kind of silence that comes from lives spent doing not talking. An old man in a canvas jacket slept with his head against the window. A woman with a grocery bag on her lap stared at nothing. No one spoke to Rowan. He was used to that. He was used to being the empty seat. No one chose the face, no one remembered. He folded himself against the window and let the miles pass. The bus stop was not really a stop at all. It was a wide gravel shoulder on the side of a two-lane highway with a faded sign marking a rural route number and nothing else. No building, no bench, no shelter. Just the road and the trees and the sky. The bus pulled away with a diesel groan and left him standing in a silence so complete it felt like a physical substance, thick and strange, pressing against his ears. The air was different here, clean, cold, sharp with pine and damp earth, and something underneath it, something old and mineral and alive. A smell from a world he had never inhabited. The address on the deed corresponded to the rural route. Rowan had asked the bus driver, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen the same stretch of road 10,000 times, where the route led. The driver had looked at him, looked at his thin jacket and his worn sneakers and his cardboard box, and pointed down a narrow, unpaved road that disappeared into the tree line. 4 miles that way, the driver said. Hope you got good boots. He did not have good boots. He did not have any boots. He had sneakers with soles worn thin enough to feel every stone, and the gravel road punished him for it with every step. The road was narrow and rutted, flanked by towering Douglas firs that closed overhead like the walls of a cathedral. The light was green and diffuse, filtered through a million needles, and the silence was alive with small sounds. The creak of branches, the distant knock of a woodpecker, the rustle of something unseen moving through the underbrush. The walk took over an hour. His feet ached, his legs burned, but something strange happened as he walked. The fear, which had been a constant companion since the door of North Ridge had closed, began to change. It did not go away, but it shifted from the sharp, panicked fear of the city, fear of being seen, fear of being caught, fear of being nothing, to something quieter, deeper, older. The forest did not care about him. The trees were not hostile. They were not indifferent in the way people were indifferent. They were simply there, vast and patient, and their patience was not a judgment. It was an invitation. And then the road opened, and he saw it. The Quonset hut sat in the center of a clearing, maybe 5 acres of open ground surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest. It was a long, arched structure, maybe 40 feet from end to end, its corrugated steel skin rusted to a deep mottled orange and brown that almost made it look like it had been painted to blend in with the autumn hills. The arch of its roof was a perfect half-cylinder, and from a distance it looked less like a building and more like the rib cage of some enormous animal, half buried in the earth and forgotten. The land around it was wild. Overgrown grass waist-high in some places, brown and dry at the ends, but still green at the roots. Blackberry vines crawled up the sides of the hut in thick, thorny ropes. Wildflowers, late-season asters and goldenrod dotted the meadow in patches of purple and yellow. The ground sloped gently upward behind the hut to a natural berm, a low rise of earth and rock, maybe 20 feet high, covered in scrub and fir saplings. There was no house, no barn, no mailbox, no sign that anyone had been here in years. Just this metal shell and the land and the sky and the overwhelming, crushing silence. Mr. Whitfield was right. There was nothing here. Rowan stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, the box under one arm, the wind pulling at his hoodie, and let the nothing wash over him. He had expected to feel disappointment. He had expected anger or grief, or the bitter, familiar taste of being let down by a world that had never once kept its promises. But what he felt was something else entirely, something he could not name, a stillness, a pause, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. The key was heavy in his hand as he walked to the front of the hut. The door was a flat panel of steel, dented and streaked with rust, set into the front wall like an afterthought. The lock was old, a heavy deadbolt mechanism coated in grime, and the key did not want to go in. Rowan had to work at twisting and pushing the metal, grinding against metal, until finally he put his shoulder into it and felt the lock give way with a loud, grating crack that echoed inside the structure like a gunshot. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed in protest, and a breath of air rolled out. Cold, stale, dense with the smell of rust and motor oil and mouse droppings and old wood and time. The kind of air that has been sealed away undisturbed for years. It smelled like a tomb. He stepped inside. The interior was a single vast open space, the curved walls rising on either side like the inside of a barrel. Light came in through 4 small plexiglass windows set high in the walls, 2 on each side, and it fell in pale, dusty shafts that illuminated the floating particles in the air like tiny constellations. The floor was poured, concrete cracked in places, stained with oil and God knows what else. The air was thick enough to taste. Against the left wall ran a long wooden workbench, sturdy and scarred with use. On it and around it was the detritus of a life spent working with hands. Coffee cans full of nails and bolts and screws sorted by size. Mason jars cloudy with age, containing liquids he could not identify. Hand tools hung on a pegboard above the bench, their outlines traced in faded marker wrenches. Pliers, files, each in its designated place. Though several hooks were empty, their tools gone to wherever lost things go. In the right corner stood a cast-iron wood stove, black and squat and solid, with a rusted stovepipe that angled up and through the curved ceiling. Next to it, a stack of split firewood, old and dry gray, with age but still solid. In the center of the space, draped in a heavy canvas tarp furred with dust, was the unmistakable shape of a vehicle. Rowan lifted the edge of the tarp and saw a pickup truck, a late 1970s Ford. Its blue paint faded to a ghostly pale, its tires flat, its windshield clouded with dust but uncracked. The keys were in the ignition. A can of gasoline sat on the floor beside it. And in the far back corner, almost lost in the deepest shadow, was a simple wooden cot with a thin stained mattress. Next to it on the concrete floor sat a small metal footlocker, olive drab, the kind the military issued a lifetime ago. This was it. This was his grandfather's world. This was the sum total of what Henry Mercer had left behind. A metal shell full of tools and dust and silence, and one old truck that probably would never run again. Rowan dropped his duffel bag on the floor. The sound was swallowed by the space absorbed by the curved walls and the dust and the emptiness. And the weight of it all, the finality, the loneliness, the sheer absurd cruelty of inheriting nothing but a rusting shed at the end of a dirt road hit him like a wave. It did not knock him down. It pulled the ground out from under him. He sank to the concrete floor. The cold seeped through his jeans into his bones, into the hollow center of him. And for the first time since the door of Northridge had closed that morning, for the first time in years, if he was honest, he let himself break. He cried. He cried the way you cry when there is no one to hear you and no reason to stop. He cried for the childhood that had been taken from him, for the parents who were nothing but names on a form, for the grandfather who was nothing but a signature on a deed. He cried for every night in every group home where he had swallowed his tears and stared at the ceiling and told himself that someday it would be different. He cried until his throat was raw and his eyes burned and there was nothing left inside him but a vast, aching emptiness that felt like it might swallow him whole. The light in the windows faded, purple, then gray, then black. The October night came on fast, and with it came the cold, a deep, penetrating cold that radiated up from the concrete and down from the metal walls surrounding him from every direction. He could not stay on the floor. The cold would not allow it. Survival, that most basic and stubborn of instincts, dragged him to his feet. He found matches on the workbench, a book of them, damp and old. It took him 11 tries, his fingers shaking his breath, clouding in the frigid air before one caught. He fed it to a nest of dry newspaper on the grate of the wood stove, then added kindling, then a split log from the stack. The fire caught with a crackle that sounded like applause and warmth bloomed in the stove and pushed outward in a slow expanding circle, fragile and tentative but real. He sat beside it on the concrete, the tarp from the truck draped over his shoulders, and let the heat find him. The flames cast long, dancing shadows on the curved walls, turning the interior of the Quonset into something that almost felt alive, almost felt like a place where a person could exist. Hunger clawed at his stomach, but there was nothing to eat. His last few dollars had gone to the bus ticket. He found the water spigot outside attached to a hand pump sunk into the ground. It took 5 minutes of desperate muscle-burning effort to prime it, the handle stiff and resistant, fighting him with every stroke. But then suddenly, water came first, a trickle of rust-colored liquid, then a gush of clear icy water that poured over his hands and splashed onto the dead grass. He cupped his palms and drank. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache, and it tasted of stone and iron and deep earth. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. It was the taste of something that had been waiting underground for a very long time. Back inside, the fire had transformed the space. The stove ticked and popped as the metal expanded with heat, and the warmth had pushed the worst of the cold back into the corners. The shadows on the walls were softer now, almost gentle, and the wind outside had become a low, steady moan that pressed against the steel skin of the hut like a hand testing a door. And then the rain came. It started as a whisper, a soft pattering on the metal roof, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But it grew. Within minutes, it was a roar, a full thundering drumroll of water on corrugated steel that filled the entire space with sound. It was the loudest, most encompassing thing Rowan had ever heard. It was not like the city where noise was a constant overlapping chaos. This was singular, immense, a wall of sound that was somehow both overwhelming and deeply, strangely comforting. The rain on the roof was saying something. It was saying, you are inside. You are sheltered. You are still here. In the firelight, his eyes fell on the small white envelope. It was still in the cardboard box, resting on the workbench where he had set it down. His name in that shaky, deliberate hand. the handwriting of a man he had never met writing to a boy he would never see. There was nowhere left to run, no more distance to put between himself and the truth. He was at the end of the road in every possible sense, and the dead man's words were the only thing left unopened. He picked up the envelope. The paper was thick cream colored, the kind that cost more than it should. The seal was old glue, brittle with age. It cracked under his thumb. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was small, precise, each letter formed with the careful pressure of someone whose hands were failing, but whose mind was not. He unfolded it beside the fire and began to read. Rowan, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you are 18. I am sorry. I am sorry for all of it. I am sorry I could not be there to see you become a man. I am sorry for the life you have had. None of it was what I wanted for you. He had to stop. The words were not what he expected. He had expected legal language, instructions, a cold, formal document from a cold, formal man. But this was none of those things. This was grief. This was a wound written down and sealed in an envelope and left to wait for 18 years. He moved closer to the fire. The light turned the paper amber. He read on. There are things you do not know about your parents. Things you do not know about me. Your father, my son, was a good man who made a terrible mistake. He got involved with people who do not forgive mistakes. He owed them money, a great deal of it. When he and your mother died, that debt did not die with them. It fell to me, and they made it very clear that one day it would fall to you. Rowan's blood went cold. The hut, which had been growing warmer, suddenly felt like a cave again. These people are connected to a company called Orion Land Corporation. They do not want money, Rowan. They want this land. There is a spring on the north end of the property. It is one of the purest natural water sources in the state. And beneath the soil, there is a significant deposit of rare earth minerals. Not enough to make us wealthy, but enough for a company like Orion to want it very, very badly. They have been trying to force our family off this land for years. Legal threats, intimidation, offers that sound generous, but are designed to make you desperate. When I got sick, I knew I could not protect you anymore. The system, for all its cruelties, was the only place I could hide you. I gave up my legal rights as your guardian. I let the state take you. I made it look like I had abandoned you. The words blurred. Rowan set the letter down on his knee and pressed his palms against his eyes. The hollow, aching truth that had lived at the center of his life since he was 6 years old, the truth that he had been abandoned, that he was unwanted, that no one had ever chosen him, that truth was a lie. His grandfather had not thrown him away. His grandfather had hidden him. It was not rejection. It was sacrifice, the most painful, desperate, loving sacrifice a man could make. He picked up the letter. His hands were shaking hard enough to make the paper rattle, but he read. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It broke my heart every single day until the day my heart finally gave out. But it was the only way to keep you off their radar until you turned 18 and could hold the deed to this land in your own name. They cannot take it from a legal adult who has not signed it away. They can only pressure you. And they will. They will come for you, Rowan. They will offer you money, a great deal of it, enough to make you forget this place, forget me, forget everything. Mr. Whitfield will tell you to take it. He is a good man, but he does not know the whole truth. I could not risk telling him. You have two choices. Sell the land and walk away. I will not blame you. You have earned an easy life. God knows you have earned it. Or stay. The handwriting changed here. It became more deliberate, more precise. The tremor in the letters smoothed out as if the act of writing these words had steadied the old man's hand, as if this was the part he had been building toward. This Quonset hut is more than a shed. I designed it for a purpose I never had the strength to finish. It is meant to be an earth-sheltered home. You must cover it. Use the earth from the high berm behind the hut. Dig it, haul it, cover the sides, cover the roof, bury it under 2 feet of soil, leave only the front face exposed. The door, the windows, nothing more. Brace the interior walls with timber before you begin. I have marked the stress points inside with chalk. Cut posts from the fallen trees on the east edge of the property. Use the truck to haul them. When the earth is on plant sod, harvest it from the meadow. Lay it thick. Within a season it will root and grow and the hut will disappear. It will become a hill, a rise in the land, invisible, insulated from heat and cold. With the stove and the well, you can live here for almost nothing. You will be safe. You will be hidden. They cannot take what they cannot find. Rowan read the instructions again, and then again. Then, the precision of it was staggering. Every detail accounted for, every problem anticipated. This was not a letter written in a moment of desperation. This was a blueprint designed over years by a man who knew he was dying, who knew his grandson would one day stand exactly where Rowan was standing now, and who had spent his final days making sure that when that moment came, the boy would have everything he needed. Inside of the footlocker by the cot, the letter continued, "You will find my tools, seeds, and some money, not much, but enough to pay the taxes and buy supplies for the first months. The choice is yours, son." Rowan stood up. His legs were stiff, his knees aching from the cold concrete. He walked to the back corner of the hut to the olive-drab footlocker sitting in the shadow beside the cot. He had glanced at it earlier and assumed it was empty, just another relic. He lifted the lid. The hinges were oiled and silent. Someone had maintained this. Inside, arranged with a military precision, were hand tools. A hammer, two hand saws, one for wood, one for metal, a level, a set of wrenches, a heavy-duty staple gun, a box of galvanized nails. Beneath the tools in canvas bags tied with twine were seeds. He read the labels written in the same spidery hand. Potatoes, beans, squash, kale, carrots, seeds for a garden, seeds for a future. And beneath everything wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string was a stack of cash. He counted it with fingers that would not stop trembling. It was just over the amount on the tax bill with a few $100s to spare. Henry Mercer had saved this money over years, probably decades, setting aside small amounts, hiding them from whoever was watching, tucking them into this footlocker, in this metal shed at the end of a dirt road, all for this moment, all for the grandson he had been forced to give away. This was not an inheritance of money, it was an inheritance of a chance. One single, difficult, beautiful chance. Rowan went back to the fire. He sat down with the letter in his lap and the cash on the floor beside him, and the key still in his pocket, warm now from being held so long. The rain had stopped. The silence that followed was enormous, as if the whole world had paused to listen. The two paths lay before him as clear and stark as a fork in a road. He could sell, take the money from Orion, walk away, find a room somewhere, get a goal, build a quiet, anonymous life, be the kid who took the smart option, the expected option, the option that everyone, Whitfield, the system, the whole machinery of the world had already assumed he would take. Or he could stay. He could honor a dead man's sacrifice. He could pick up a shovel and move a mountain one load at a time. He could bury this metal shell in earth and sit on and make it disappear. He could plant seeds in soil that belonged to his family. He could fight. It was an insane choice. He knew nothing about construction, nothing about farming, nothing about survival. He was a product of fluorescent lights and cafeteria food and beige walls. His hands were soft. His body was thin. He had never built anything in his life. But as the fire burned low and the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the plexiglass windows, something shifted inside him. A small, quiet movement like a seed cracking underground. For 18 years, his story had been written by other people, caseworkers and judges and administrators. He was a file number, a bed assignment, a mouth to feed until the funding ran out. Selling the land would be one more chapter in that story. The orphan who took the safe bet, the boy who ran. But what if he did not run? What if for the first time in his life he picked up the pen? The fear was still there. It lived in his chest like a second heartbeat, cold and fast. But now it was braided with something else, something he almost did not recognize because he had never felt it before. Defiance. He thought of Henry Mercer, an old man alone dying in the same metal shell, writing that letter by candlelight or lamplight, or the last of his failing eyesight, packing that footlocker with the desperate precision of a man building an ark before a flood, holding on to one final stubborn hope that the boy he had been forced to abandon would one day stand in this exact spot and choose to stay. How could he let that hope die? How could he walk away from the only real gift anyone had ever given him? When the sun came up pale and gold through the open door of the Quonset hut, Rowan Mercer was standing. His eyes were red. His body was stiff. His stomach was empty. But his hands, those soft, pale, untested hands, were wrapped around the handle of a shovel he had pulled from the workbench. He was not going to sell. He was not going to run. He was going to dig. The first thing Rowan did was try to start the truck. Not because he wanted to go anywhere, but because the truck was the difference between possible and impossible. Without it, he was a boy with a shovel. With it, he was a boy with a shovel and a way to get to town. The Ford sat under the tarp like a sleeping animal, patient and still waiting to be woken. Rowan pulled the canvas off in one long, dusty sweep, and the truck emerged into the pale morning light, a relic from another era. The paint had faded from blue to a ghostly, oxidized gray, and rust had eaten into the wheel wells and along the edges of the bed in ragged, lace-like patterns. The tires were flat, completely deflated, resting on their rims like a horse standing on broken legs. But the windshield was intact. The cab was dry, and the keys were in the ignition, right where his grandfather had left them, as if Henry Mercer had parked the truck one final time, turned off the engine, and said, "He will need this." Rowan found the manual tire pump hanging on the wall behind the workbench. It was a heavy cast-iron contraption with a wooden handle, the kind that turned air into a negotiation between your body and the machine. He connected it to the first tire and began pumping. The rhythm was brutal. Down, up each stroke, pushing a pitiful amount of air into the cracked rubber. His arms burned after 3 minutes. His shoulders screamed after 5. But the tire slowly, almost reluctantly, began to rise from the rim. It took him the entire morning to inflate all 4 tires. By the time the last one was firm enough to hold weight, his arms were shaking so badly he could barely grip the pump handle. His palms were already red, the skin tender and hot, a preview of what was coming. He climbed into the cab. The seat was cracked vinyl cold against his legs, and the dashboard was a simple arrangement of gauges and switches that belonged to a time when trucks were built to work, not to impress. The cab smelled of old leather and gasoline and something else, pipe tobacco, faint and ghostly, trapped in the fabric of the seat. His grandfather's smell. A man he had never met reduced to a scent in an old truck. Rowan turned the key. The engine groaned. A long, low mechanical complaint, the sound of metal that has been still too long, being asked to move again. He turned it again. The groan deepened, stuttered, caught for half a second, then died. He sat there, his hand on the key, his jaw tight. He turned it a third time, and this time he pressed the gas pedal gently, the way you coax a fire with a breath instead of a blast, and the engine caught. It roared to life with a guttural, shuddering thunder that shook the entire cab and sent a cloud of black exhaust billowing out the tailpipe and into the morning air. The sound was enormous in the quiet clearing. Birds scattered from the trees. The engine settled into a rough, uneven, idle coughing and sputtering like a man waking from a long illness. But it was running. It was alive. Rowan gripped the steering wheel with both hands. The vinyl was cold and cracked under his fingers, and the wheel had a looseness to it, a dead zone of play that meant the truck would wander on the road like a deer following a scent. But it moved. He put it in gear, felt the transmission engage with a heavy clunk, and the truck rolled forward out of the Quonset hut and into the daylight for the first time in what must have been years. The drive to the county seat took just over an hour. The dirt road was a punishment. Every rut and pothole transmitted directly through the stiff suspension and into Rowan's spine. The brakes were soft, requiring him to press the pedal nearly to the floor to slow down, and the steering demanded constant correction, a continuous conversation between his hands and the road. But the truck held. The engine ran. And as the dirt road gave way to pavement, and the pavement widened into a 2-lane highway, Rowan felt something he had not felt since he was a child. Motion with purpose. He was going somewhere. He was doing something. He was not being moved. He was moving. The county seat was a small town built around a central square, the kind of place where the courthouse is the tallest building and the diner across the street has not changed its menu since the Eisenhower administration. The courthouse itself was a handsome brick structure with white columns and a clock tower that had stopped at 10:14, though no one could say which 10:14 morning or evening or how many years ago. Rowan parked the truck on the square. He sat in the cab for a full minute, the engine idling, the wad of cash in his jacket pocket, feeling enormous and conspicuous, as if everyone on the street could see it through the fabric. Then he killed the engine, got out, and walked into the tax assessor's office. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s, with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and an expression that suggested she had been interrupted from something more important, which, given the absolute stillness of the empty office, seemed unlikely. She looked at Rowan the way people had been looking at him his entire life. A quick, assessing glance that took in his age, his clothes, his general air of not belonging, and filed him under not worth the trouble. He put the tax bill on the counter and the cash beside it. She looked at the bill. She looked at the wow. She looked at him. "You are paying the full delinquent amount," she said. It was not a question. It was a confirmation of something she had not expected to see today or possibly ever. "Yes, ma'am." She counted the money twice, her fingers quick and precise, then stamped the bill with a heavy mechanical stamp that made a sound like a judge's gavel. She handed him a receipt. The paper was still warm from the printer. "You are current through the end of the fiscal year," she said. "Next payment is due in April." He folded the receipt and put it in his pocket next to the key. Two pieces of paper, one that said the land was his, one that said it was paid for. He walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than he had in years, though his pockets were nearly empty. With the remaining money, he bought supplies. He was careful, calculating each purchase against the dwindling bills with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. A sturdy, round point shovel, the best he could afford, with a fiberglass handle that would not crack in the cold. A steel wheelbarrow. Heavy leather work gloves. A new axe head to replace the one on the cracked handle he had found in the hut. And food. Not the kind of food you buy when you have choices, but the kind you buy when every calorie is a strategic decision. 50-pound sacks of rice and dried beans, flour, salt, a case of canned vegetables, a bag of oatmeal. Coffee, because coffee is not a luxury when you are alone in the wilderness. Coffee is a reason to get out of bed. He loaded everything into the truck bed, the springs sagging under the weight, and drove back. The road felt different this time. The same ruts, the same potholes, the same endless corridor of trees. But something had shifted. He was not driving away from anything. He was driving towards something. He was driving home. The work began the next morning, and it was the hardest thing Rowan Mercer had ever done. His grandfather's letter had been specific. Use the earth from the high berm behind the hut. The berm was a natural rise, maybe 20 feet high, composed of dense, rocky clay soil packed tight by centuries of rain and root and gravity. It was the kind of earth that does not want to be moved, the kind that fights you for every inch. Rowan started at the base with his new shovel. He drove the blade in, stepped on the shoulder with his full weight, and levered out a clump of soil the size of a loaf of bread. It was heavy, dense, and wet, and it clung to the shovel like it was trying to hold on. He dropped it into the wheelbarrow. One shovelful. He looked at the berm. He looked at the Quonset hut, 40 feet long, its curved walls rising 10 feet at the peak. He would need to cover all of its sides and roof in a layer 2 feet thick. The math was staggering. The volume of earth required was measured in tons, hundreds of wheelbarrow loads, thousands of shovelfuls. And he was one person with one shovel and a body that had never done a day of real physical labor in its life. He lasted 2 hours that first day. His hands, even inside the new gloves, blistered within 30 minutes, the soft skin shearing away from the underlying tissue in hot, fluid-filled welts that burst and stung and bled. His lower back seized up after an hour, a deep, grinding pain that radiated down his legs and up into his ribs. His shoulders, unused to the repetitive overhead motion of lifting and throwing, locked into knots so tight he could not raise his arms above his head. He stopped not because he chose to, but because his body refused to continue. He dropped the shovel, walked to the front of the hut, and looked at what he had accomplished. The pile of earth against the base of the wall was pathetic. A thin, ragged smear of brown against the vast expanse of corrugated steel. The hut seemed to mock him with its size, its indifferent metal surface catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in his face. That night he could barely move. Getting from the cot to the stove to add wood to the fire was an expedition, each step sending jolts of pain through muscles he did not know he possessed. He ate a bowl of rice and beans, the simplest meal he could manage, with hands that could barely grip a spoon, and he lay on the cot and stared at the curved ceiling and wondered with the clear, cold logic of exhaustion if he had made a terrible mistake. But he got up the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. A rhythm established itself, not chosen but discovered the way a river finds its course. He woke with the light, the first gray suggestion of dawn filtering through the plexiglass windows. He started the fire. He made coffee in a battered tin percolator he found on a shelf. Grounds boiled until the liquid was thick and black and strong enough to dissolve doubt. He ate oatmeal, and then he went outside and picked up the shovel. The days took on a brutal, beautiful simplicity. Dig, load, haul, dump, spread, walk back, dig again. The wheelbarrow became an extension of his body, its single wheel tracing the same path from the berm to the hut until a groove wore into the grass, a narrow, muddy track that deepened with each trip. He learned the precise angle at which to drive the shovel into the clay to maximize each load while minimizing the strain on his back. He learned the exact balance point of the wheelbarrow that kept it from tipping on the uneven ground. He learned that the work was not about strength, it was about rhythm. It was about finding the pace you could sustain for hours, the pace that lived just below the threshold of collapse, and staying there. His body fought him at first. Every morning was a negotiation with pain, a slow, agonizing process of uncurling from the cot, stretching muscles that had stiffened overnight into ropes of fire, and convincing himself that today would be slightly less terrible than yesterday. And it was, not by much, not enough to feel like progress, but enough to keep going. After 2 weeks, something began to change. The blisters on his hands dried and hardened into calluses, thick pads of yellowish skin that no longer split or bled. The pain in his back receded from a sharp scream to a dull, manageable ache. His shoulders loosened, his breathing steadied, and in the small, round mirror he had hung on the wall by the cot, he began to see a different person looking back. The hollow cheeks were filling out. The thin, pale arms were thickening, the muscles defining themselves beneath the skin like ropes under canvas. His body was being rewritten by the work line, by line, muscle by muscle, transformed from the soft indoor thing he had always been into something harder, something built for this exact purpose. And as his body changed, the world around him came into focus. He had been so consumed by the work, so trapped inside the tunnel of dig and haul and dump, that he had not noticed the land was talking to him. Now he began to hear it, the way the light moved through the trees throughout the day, shifting from cold blue in the morning to warm gold in the afternoon to deep amber at dusk. The songs of birds he could not name, different at dawn than at noon, different again at twilight. The tracks in the soft earth by the well raccoon and rabbit and deer, written in a language he was slowly learning to read. One evening as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the sky turned the color of a bruise, he saw a doe and 2 fawns step out of the tree line and into the meadow. They moved with a careful, liquid grace, their heads dipping to the grass, their ears rotating like radar dishes. The doe looked up and saw him standing by the door of the hut, and for a long moment they regarded each other across the meadow, 2 creatures sharing the same piece of earth, and then the doe lowered her head and went back to grazing, having decided that he was not a threat. He was a part of this place now. The land had accepted him. The loneliness was still there. It never left entirely, but it changed shape. In the group homes, loneliness had been a sharp cutting thing, the loneliness of being surrounded by people and known by none of them. Here it was softer, wider, more like a landscape than a wound. He was alone, but he was not abandoned. The trees did not judge him. The sky did not look away. The earth, which he spent every day moving and shaping, received his effort without complaint and held it. It was in the 3rd week that the truck appeared on the road. Rowan heard it before he saw it, the distant growl of an engine on the dirt road, a sound so foreign in the silence of the clearing that it sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. He set down the wheelbarrow and watched as a battered pickup red with rust spots and a dented tailgate emerged from the trees and rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing. The driver was an old man, not old the way Whitfield was old, stuffed and desk-worn, old the way the hills were old, weathered and hard, and shaped by decades of exposure to the elements. He was tall and lean with a face like a topographic map, every line a valley, every crease a ridge. His hair was white and cut short, and his hands when he climbed out of the truck were enormous, the knuckles swollen, the fingers thick and scarred. He stood by his truck and looked at the Quonset hut and the growing pile of earth against its walls, and then he looked at Rowan, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. as if he had been expecting this. "Saw your smoke," he said. His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that had been cured by decades of cold air and wood smoke and not much conversation. The name's Dutch. Rowan stood with the shovel in his hand, his body tensed, every instinct from 12 years in the system, telling him to be careful, to say nothing, to give away nothing. Strangers meant trouble. Strangers meant change. And change in Rowan's experience was never good. But the old man did not move closer. He did not ask questions. He simply stood by his truck, his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket, his eyes moving over the work with the practiced assessment of a man who understood what he was looking at. "Rowan Mercer," Rowan said. "Fixing up my grandfather's place." Dutch nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already guessed. He looked at the berm, at the raw wound in the hillside where Rowan had been digging, and at the thin layer of earth packed against the base of the hut. His eyes were pale blue, faded by sun, and they missed nothing. "That is a lot of digging for one man," he said. He did not say it with pity. He did not say it with judgment. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Observation. Nothing more. They stood there in silence for a moment, two figures in a clearing, the wind moving through the trees. Then Rowan, surprising himself, asked if the man wanted coffee. They sat on upturned logs by the door of the hut and drank coffee from tin cups, and Dutch told him a few things. He lived about 4 miles north on a piece of land his family had worked for 3 generations. He knew these hills. He knew the weather, the soil, the rhythms of the seasons. He had known Henry Mercer. The name hit Rowan like a sudden change in temperature. He held his coffee cup tighter and said nothing, waiting. "Good man," Dutch said, staring into the tree line. "Kept to himself. Worked hard. Was sick a long time at the end." That was all he said about it. No stories, no details, no sentimental eulogy. Just those 4 short sentences delivered with the economy of a man who believed that words like firewood should not be wasted. But they were enough. They were the first words Rowan had ever heard spoken about his grandfather by someone who had actually known him, and they landed in his chest and stayed there warm and solid like a stone pulled from the fire. Dutch left after 1 cup of coffee. He did not say goodbye. He simply stood up, nodded once, got in his truck, and drove away. The next afternoon, Rowan heard the truck again. Dutch pulled up, got out, and without a word, dropped the tailgate and unloaded a rusty but serviceable rototiller from the bed of his truck. He set it on the ground at the edge of the berm. "Easier than a shovel for breaking up that top layer," he grunted. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. Rowan stood there looking at the machine for a long time. It was not new. It was not fancy. It was a battered, oil-stained piece of equipment that had probably been sitting in Dutch's barn for years. But it was help, freely given. No forms to sign, no conditions attached, no caseworker's signature required. Just one man leaving a tool for another man who needed it. It was the first time in Rowan's life that kindness had come without paperwork. The rototiller changed the pace of the work. It chewed through the top layer of the berm. In a fraction of the time, the shovel required loosening the dense clay into manageable chunks that were easier to load and haul. The progress, which had been measured in inches, began to be measured in feet. The earth climbed the walls of the Quonset inch by inch, day by day, transforming the corrugated steel into something else, something that was slowly being swallowed by the land itself. Inside, following the chalk marks his grandfather had left on the walls, Rowan braced the structure with heavy timber posts cut from fallen trees on the east edge of the property. He used the truck to drag the logs out of the woods, then trim them with the axe and handsaw, fitting them vertically against the curved walls at the stress points Henry had marked. The posts would bear the immense weight of the earth, transferring it down through the concrete floor and into the bedrock below. Without them, the hut would have buckled and collapsed under the load. With them, it was becoming something stronger than steel. It was becoming architecture. Earth and metal and wood working together, each element supporting the others. The letter from Orion Land Corporation arrived on a Tuesday 5 weeks into the work. It came not by mail but by courier. A man in a clean uniform driving a white sedan that looked like it had never seen a dirt road before. He pulled up to the edge of the clearing, his tires spinning briefly in the mud, and got out holding a thick envelope with the look of someone who wanted to deliver his package and leave as quickly as possible. The envelope was heavy cream-colored, made of the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than Rowan spent on food in a day. The logo in the upper left corner was a stylized green leaf, the same one on the business card Whitfield had given him. Orion Land Corporation. The leaf was smooth and perfect, designed by someone in a glass office who had probably never planted a seed in their life. The letter inside was 3 pages long, printed on matching paper, and written in the careful, measured language of people who hire lawyers to say what they mean without actually saying it. It began by congratulating Rowan on his inheritance. It expressed Orion's deep commitment to the economic development of the Cascade Foothills region. It outlined the benefits of their proposed resort project, the jobs, the infrastructure, the prosperity that would flow through the community like water through a dry creek bed. And then with the smooth, practiced pivot of a predator changing direction, it mentioned the challenges of rural property ownership for someone in Rowan's position. The rising cost of property taxes, the expense of maintenance and upkeep, the isolation, the difficulty of making a living from raw, undeveloped land. The letter noted almost as an aside that the upcoming winter in the foothills could be particularly harsh, and that the county had recently tightened its regulations on unpermitted structures. The final paragraph restated their generous offer to purchase the property at a price that was, the letter assured him, well above market value. A sum of money that would provide Rowan with a genuine fresh start, an apartment, a vehicle, tuition at the community college of his choice, a future. At the bottom, in a handwritten note that was clearly meant to feel personal, someone had written, "We look forward to hearing from you at your earliest convenience." Rowan read the letter twice. The first time his hands shook. The second time they did not. He folded the letter, carried it inside, opened the door of the wood stove, and fed it to the flames. He watched the expensive paper curl and blacken, watched the green leaf logo turn to ash, and felt a heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They knew who he was. They knew he was here. They were watching. He went back outside, picked up the shovel, and drove it into the berm with more force than was necessary. Every shovelful of earth after that felt different. It felt like an answer. You want this land, you will have to go through a mountain to get it. The phone call started 2 weeks later. Rowan had bought a cheap prepaid phone in town, mostly for emergencies. The number was not listed anywhere. He had given it to no one except the hardware store in case his supply order came in. But somehow Orion had it. The first call came at 7 in the evening, just as Rowan was sitting down to eat. A blocked number. He answered out of reflex, and a voice came through the tiny speaker that was unlike any voice he had encountered in his 18 years of life. It was smooth and calm, and perfectly modulated, the voice of a man who had been trained to sound reasonable the way a blade is trained to be sharp. "Rowan, my name is Pryor. I represent Orion Land Corporation. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The courtesy was a weapon. Rowan could feel it the way you can feel the edge of a cliff before you see it. "I want you to know," Pryor continued, "that we have no interest in being adversarial. Quite the opposite. We see an opportunity here for everyone, and we want to make sure you understand what is on the table. You are a young man with your whole life ahead of you. A smart young man from what I can tell. Smart enough to understand that sentiment is a luxury and survival is a negotiation." Rowan said nothing. The silence on his end was not strategic. He simply did not know what to say. He had never been spoken to like this, not with the practiced velvet menace of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. Pryor filled the silence without effort. "We know about the hut, Rowan. We know about the condition of the property. We know that you are out there alone with no experience, no support system, and a very limited amount of resources. This is not a criticism. It is a fact. And facts are what we deal in. Our offer stands, and it is generous. Think of it as a bridge to the life you deserve, not the one you inherited." Rowan hung up. His hand was steady, but his heartbeat was not. The calls continued. Every few days, always from a blocked number, always at a time calculated to catch him at his most tired, his most vulnerable. Pryor never raised his voice. He never made an explicit threat. He did not need to. His weapon was not aggression. It was erosion. He talked about the coming winter, about the sub-zero temperatures, about the isolation that drove men to madness. He talked about Rowan's age, his inexperience, the statistical likelihood of failure. He talked about the other landowners in the area who had sold to Orion and were now living comfortably in town, warm and fed and free of worry. This is not about us and you, Pryor said during one call. This is about mathematics. The math does not care about your feelings. The math says you will not make it through the winter. And when you don't, we will still be here and the offer will be lower. Each call left a residue, a thin film of doubt that settled over Rowan's resolve like dust on a surface. The words burrowed into the cracks in his confidence and expanded there slowly the way ice expands in rock. Was he being foolish? Was this whole thing, the digging, the building, the stubborn refusal to sell, just the romantic delusion of a boy who had read too many books and confused fiction with reality? He did not answer the calls anymore, but he could not stop hearing the voice. And then in the sixth week, something happened that turned doubt into fear. Rowan had driven to town for supplies, a trip that took most of the morning. When he returned, the gate he had fashioned from wire and scrap wood at the entrance to the property was open. He had closed it. He always closed it. It was a habit born from a lifetime of checking locks and doors and windows, the reflex of someone who had learned early that the world will enter your space if you let it. He drove slowly up the road to the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line, his hands tight on the wheel. At first, everything looked normal. The hut, the berm, the pile of earth, the wheelbarrow sitting where he had left it. But then he saw them. Tire tracks, fresh ones. A vehicle with wide new tires had driven into the clearing, circled the hut and driven back out. The tracks went right up to the walls of the Quonset, close enough that whoever was driving could have looked through the windows. Inside the hut, nothing was missing. Nothing was moved, but the feeling of violation was total. Someone had been here. Someone had walked his ground, looked through his windows, assessed his progress and left. They had not knocked. They had not announced themselves. They had come like thieves, studied what he was building, and vanished. Orion was not just watching. They were measuring. They were tracking how fast the earth was going up, calculating how much time they had before the hut disappeared beneath it. This was not harassment anymore. It was reconnaissance. The realization hit Rowan with the force of cold water. He was in a race. The hut had to be covered completely before Orion could document it as a structure. Once the earth was on and the sod was planted, it would be a hill, a natural feature, invisible. But until then, every day the corrugated steel was visible was a day they could photograph it, measure it, report it as an unpermitted construction. The letter had mentioned Titan County regulations. That was not an idle threat. It was a timeline. He worked faster. He worked longer. He pushed himself past the limits he had established in those first weeks, extending his days from dawn past dusk, digging by the last light of the sky and then by the light of a kerosene lantern he had found on the workbench. The earth climbed the walls. The steel disappeared inch by inch, foot by foot, swallowed by the clay and soil and rock. November came, and with it the first snow. It arrived overnight, a silent, transformative event that turned the world from brown and green to a uniform blinding white. The temperature dropped like a stone. The ground, which had been yielding reluctantly to his shovel, froze in the mornings to a depth of several inches, becoming as hard as concrete and twice as stubborn. He had to wait until afternoon when the weak sun had softened the top layer to dig effectively. His working hours shrank. The race tightened. He learned to trap. Not from a book, not from a video, but from the gnawing, persistent logic of hunger. The rice and beans were lasting, but they were not enough. His body, which was burning calories at a rate his supplies could not match, demanded more. He fashioned simple snares from wire he found in the hut, setting them along the rabbit trails he had learned to identify near the tree line. The first time he checked the snares and found a rabbit stiff and still in the wire. He stood there for a long time, the animal in his hands, feeling the weight of what it meant. He was taking a life to sustain his own. It was not a thought he had ever needed to have before. He cleaned the rabbit using a folding knife from the footlocker, working slowly, clumsily, his hands shaking not from cold but from the rawness of the act. He roasted it over the stove that night, the small body on a spit of green wood, the fat dripping and hissing on the hot iron. The meat was lean and wild and tasted of the forest. He ate every scrap, sucked the bones clean, and saved the hide. The snow deepened. The silence of the forest became something immense, a living absence of sound that was louder in its way than any city noise. Snow absorbed everything. Footsteps, wind, bird song. The world became a white room with no walls, and Rowan moved through it like the last person alive. His breath, a cloud, his shovel, the only thing that broke the silence. He learned which wood burned hottest and longest. Oak when he could find it. Douglas fir for quick heat. He never let the fire go out. The stove was the heart of the hut, and feeding it was the first task of every morning and the last task of every night. If the fire died, the water in the pump would freeze. If the pump froze, he was finished. December arrived and brought the worst of it. A cold snap dropped the temperature to 20 below. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing howling through the trees, shaking the hut, finding every gap and seam in the corrugated steel and driving needles of frigid air into the interior. The stove worked overtime, its iron sides glowing a dull red in the dark, and still the cold crept in, settling into the concrete floor, the metal walls, the very air. Rowan slept in every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped in the canvas tarp and a wool blanket he had bought in town. And still he woke in the night, shivering his breath, freezing on the edge of the blanket. It was during the worst night of the cold snap that Pryor called again. Rowan was sitting by the stove, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his body aching from a day of trying to dig frozen ground. The food supply was running low. He had calculated with the grim precision that hunger teaches you that he had enough rice and beans for another 3 weeks if he rationed carefully. After that, he would be dependent entirely on what he could trap and what he could scrounge from the dormant land. The phone buzzed on the workbench, block number. He knew he should not answer. He answered. Pryor's voice was the same, calm, measured, warm in the way that a furnace is warm, mechanical, and designed. But there was something new in it tonight, a thread of confidence that bordered on certainty. I imagine it is very cold out there tonight, Rowan. 18 below, according to the forecast. That is not weather for camping. That is weather for dying. I want you to think about something. Right now, at this very moment, I am sitting in my office, and it is 72 degrees. I have a cup of good coffee. I have heat that I did not have to chop wood for, and I have an offer on my desk with your name on it that would put you in a warm apartment by the end of the week. A pause calculated. We have doubled the offer, Rowan, doubled it, because we believe in being fair and because, frankly, we are concerned about you. An 18-year-old boy alone in the mountains in winter. This is not romance. This is a crisis, and we are offering you the way out. Rowan closed his eyes. The warmth of the stove was on his face, but the cold was at his back, and the cold was winning. He could feel it in his bones, in the ache of his hands, and the hollow of his stomach. The temptation was not abstract. It was physical. It was the memory of warmth that did not require effort. The idea of a hot shower food that someone else had cooked, a bed in a room where the temperature did not depend on whether you had the strength to split one more log. He could see it so clearly. The apartment, the door that locked from the inside, the silence that was comfort, not isolation, the normal life, the easy life, the life that everyone had always expected him to choose. He looked at the stove. He looked at his hands, cracked and calloused and scarred, the hands of a stranger. He looked at his grandfather's letter pinned to the wall above the workbench, the paper soft and gray from being handled 100 times. And he looked at the canvas bags of seeds on the shelf above the cot. Potatoes, beans, squash, seeds for a spring he had not yet earned the right to see. Henry Mercer had not left him instructions for survival. He had left him instructions for life. The seeds were not just seeds, they were faith. Faith that the pot in the metal shed would still be there when the ground thawed. Faith that he would plant them. Faith that he would grow. Rowan hung up the phone. He set it on the workbench, screen down, and he did not pick it up again. He put on his coat. He went outside into the howling, bitter dark. The snow was deep past his knees in places, and the wind cut through his jacket like it was made of paper. He found the shovel where he had left it, leaning against the wall, its handle crusted with ice. He did not dig. The ground was frozen solid, impenetrable. But he cleared a path. From the door to the well, 20 feet of snow moved one shovelful at a time. It was a small task, a meaningless task in the grand scheme of things. But it was a choice. He was choosing to stay. He was choosing to keep the path open between his door and his water. He was choosing to believe that tomorrow would come and that he would be here to meet it. Winter was long. Winter was a siege, but he survived it. He survived it the way the trees survived it, not by fighting the cold, but by going deep, by pulling everything inward, reducing life to its essentials, burning slow and steady, and refusing, absolutely refusing to go out. And then slowly, so slowly, he almost did not notice it at first, the days began to lengthen. The angle of the sun changed. The ice on the well pump thawed a few minutes earlier each morning. A bird sang one day that had not been singing before, a high, clear note that cut through the cold air like a blade of light through a curtain. Spring was coming. Rowan hauled the last of the earth in early March, working in a frenzy of effort as the ground softened and the digging became possible again. The final loads went over the top 2 feet thick across the entire roof, spread and tamped and shaped until the Quonset hut was no longer visible from any angle. The corrugated steel was gone. The arch of the roof was gone. In its place was a gentle, smooth rise of bare earth sloping naturally from the berm behind it, with only the front face exposed. The door, 2 small windows, a stovepipe poking up through the soil like a thin metal periscope. From 30 feet away, it looked like nothing. A hillside, a feature of the land, the kind of thing you would walk past without a second glance. And then as he stood on top of his buried home and looked out over the clearing at the meadow and the forest and the mountains beyond, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his body pushed past every limit he had thought he had, Rowan noticed something in the footlocker he had missed before. 4. The bottom panel, which he had assumed was solid, shifted when he lifted the last canvas bag of seeds. Beneath it was a hidden compartment, shallow no more than 2 inches deep. Inside was a small leather notebook, its cover cracked and dark with age. He opened it, his grandfather's handwriting, page after page of careful notes, coordinates, depth measurements, soil composition charts, diagrams of the property marked with precise locations, and on the first page a single line that made his blood quicken. If you have finished the earth, you are ready for what comes next. Rowan closed the notebook. He looked out at the land that was his, the land that had nearly killed him, the land that had rebuilt him from the inside out. The earth was on, the hut was buried, the steel was hidden, but the fight was not over. It was only changing shape. He held the notebook to his chest, feeling the weight of his grandfather's words, and waited for spring. Spring did not arrive. It emerged. It came up through the ground the way a secret comes up through silence, slowly, then all at once, until the world was different and you could not remember exactly when it changed. The first sign was the sound of water, dripping, trickling, running, the quiet percussion of a frozen world letting go. Ice slid from the branches of the firs in long, glassy sheets that shattered on the forest floor like broken windows. The creek at the far edge of the property, which had been a silent white scar in the snow, began to move again, its voice faint at first, then steady, then constant, a low murmur beneath everything else, like the breathing of the land itself. And then the color came. Green. Not the deep, permanent green of the conifers, but the new green, the tender, almost luminous green of things that have been waiting in the dark and are now finally reaching for the light. It started at the base of the trees, in the mosses and the ferns, and spread upward and outward across the meadow in a slow tide that turned the brown dead grass into something alive. Rowan stood in the doorway of his buried home and watched it happen. The door opened onto the clearing, as it always had, flanked by the 2 small plexiglass windows, the stovepipe rising from the earth behind like a thin metal chimney from a hobbit's den. But now, for the first time, the mound of bare soil above and around him was changing too. The earth he had hauled and spread and tamped over months of brutal labor was no longer a raw, brown wound on the hillside. Tiny green shoots were pushing through it, wild grass seeds that had been in the soil all along, dormant, waiting. The hill was beginning to heal itself, but waiting for nature was not Henry Mercer's plan. The notebook had been specific. Plant the sod, do not wait. The earth must be covered in living grass before the summer heat dries it out, and the rain carves channels in the bare soil. A hill without roots is just a pile of dirt. A hill with roots is permanent. Rowan began the next phase of work on the first warm day in April. He had no sod cutter. He had a shovel, a flat-bladed spade he had found on the workbench, in his hands. The meadow beyond the hut was thick with wild grass, the kind of deep-rooted, dense turf that had been growing undisturbed for decades. He drove the spade in at a shallow angle, slicing beneath the root mat, and peeled up a section of sod about 2 feet square and 3 inches thick. It was heavy, dense with roots and moisture and living weight, and it bent and sagged as he lifted it. He carried it to the mound, climbed the gentle slope on his hands and knees, and laid it down on the bare earth, pressing it flat with his palms, feeling the roots make contact with the soil beneath. One piece. He looked at the vast expanse of bare brown earth, still to be covered. He looked at the meadow. He picked up the spade and went back for another. The work was different from the digging. It was slower, more precise, more like surgery than demolition. Each piece of sod had to be cut to the right thickness, thin enough to carry, but thick enough to hold together. It had to be placed tightly against the previous piece edge to edge with no gaps for the rain to exploit. And it had to be done fast before the cut sod dried out and the roots died. He worked from dawn until his arms could no longer lift the heavy squares of turf, and then he worked a little longer. His back, which had been rebuilt by months of shoveling, found new ways to protest. His knees pressed into the damp earth for hours at a time, swelled and ached. But the green crept across the mound piece by piece, day by day, and the bare earth disappeared beneath a living quilt of grass and root and soil. It was during the second week of sodding that Dutch appeared again. He came in his red truck as he always did, without warning and without ceremony. But this time there was something in the bed of the truck, a piece of equipment covered with a moving blanket. Dutch killed the engine, got out, and pulled the blanket off to reveal a manual sod cutter, an old, heavy-bladed tool designed to slice turf in clean uniform strips. It was rusted in places, and the blade needed sharpening, but it was the right tool for the right job. And the fact that Dutch had it, that he had kept it, that he had brought it now at exactly the moment it was needed, told Rowan something about the old man that words never would. "Figured you were about ready for this," Dutch said. He did not stay to help. He never did. That was not the nature of what existed between them, and they both understood it without discussion. Dutch was not a partner. He was not a mentor. He was a witness. A man who had known Henry Mercer, who had watched the old man's quiet, solitary fight from a distance, and who was now watching the grandson carry it forward. His help came in the form of tools, not labor, presence, not instruction. He would sit on the tailgate of his truck once every week or two, drink a cup of Rowan's terrible coffee, say very little, and leave. And each time he left, the clearing felt slightly less lonely, not because Dutch had filled the silence, but because he had acknowledged it. One afternoon, sitting on the tailgate with the spring sun on their faces, Dutch said something that landed in Rowan's chest and stayed. "Your grandfather talked about you," he said. "Not often. He was not that kind of man. But once near the end, he told me he had a grandson somewhere in the system. Said the boy did not know he existed. Said that was the point." Dutch paused. He looked at the mound now, nearly half covered in green sod, and then at Rowan, and his faded blue eyes held something that might have been admiration or sorrow or both. He said if the boy ever showed up here and started digging, then he had made the right choice. And if the boy sold and walked away, then he had made the right choice too. Either way, the boy would be free. Dutch finished his coffee, set the cup on the tailgate, nodded once, and drove away. Rowan stood in the clearing for a long time after the sound of the truck had faded. The boy would be free. Either way, his grandfather had not left him a test. He had left him a choice. And the choice itself, the act of choosing, was the inheritance. Not the land, not the money, not the hut buried under earth. The freedom to decide. He went back to laying sod. By late April, the mound was fully covered. The grass strips had knitted together, the roots reaching down into the packed earth, binding it, holding it, making it whole. From the meadow, from the road, from any angle at all, the Quonset hut was gone. In its place was a gentle, grass-covered hill that looked as if it had been there since the last ice age. The only visible signs of human presence were the front face door and two small windows set into what appeared to be a natural rock outcropping at the base of the hill, the stovepipe emerging from the crest like a thin, inconspicuous metal tube, and the small cleared area in front, where Rowan had begun his garden. The garden was the next act of faith. He opened the canvas bags from the footlocker with a care that bordered on reverence. The seeds inside were old, stored in small paper envelopes labeled in his grandfather's hand. Potatoes, beans, squash, kale, carrots. Henry had chosen them deliberately, Rowan realized. These were not exotic crops. They were survival crops. Hardy, calorie-dense, forgiving, of poor soil and amateur hands. The kind of food that had sustained homesteaders and settlers and every stubborn human being who had ever decided to stay in a place where staying was hard. He had cleared a plot of land near the south-facing side of the mound where the sun hit longest. The soil was dark and rich, decades of meadowgrass decomposing into a loam that crumbled in his hands like cake. He worked the rototiller through it, then raked it smooth, then made rows with the edge of the spade straight and evenly spaced the way the diagrams in his grandfather's notebook showed. He planted the potatoes, first cutting the seed potatoes into pieces, each with at least 2 eyes, and burying them in shallow trenches. Then the beans pushed into the soil with his thumb, one by one, spaced a hand's width apart. Then the squash in small mounds at the edges of the plot. Then the kale and the carrots, their seeds so small they were almost invisible, scattered into shallow furrows and covered with a thin layer of earth. He watered them from the well, carrying bucket after bucket up the slight incline, the cold water sloshing over the rims and soaking his boots. And then he waited. The waiting was its own kind of labor. After months of constant grinding physical work of digging and hauling and bracing and covering, the stillness of watching dirt and hoping for something to grow was almost unbearable. He checked the garden every morning, looking for any sign of change, any disruption in the smooth surface of the soil. For days, there was nothing. The earth sat there mute and indifferent, giving no indication that anything was happening beneath its surface. And then on a morning in early May, he saw them. Two small green points, barely half an inch tall, pushing up through the dark soil in the bean row. They were so small, so fragile, so impossibly delicate that for a moment he thought they might be weeds. But they were in the row. They were where he had planted them. They were his. He knelt in the dirt and looked at them for a long time, these two tiny green flags of life, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut since he was 6 years old. It was not joy exactly. It was something deeper than joy, more fundamental, more ancient. It was the feeling of a man who has put something into the ground and watched it grow. The feeling of participation in a process that is older than memory, older than language, older than grief. The earth gives back what you give it. Not always, not easily, but it gives. He was no longer surviving. He was growing. The garden exploded over the following weeks. The beans climbed the simple trellises he built from branches. The potato plants spread their dark green leaves across the mounded rows. The squash sent runners in every direction, their broad leaves shading the soil, their yellow flowers opening to the bees that appeared as if summoned by some ancient contract between insects and gardeners. The kale stood upright in sturdy blue-green rosettes. The carrots feathered the soil with delicate fern-like tops. Rowan ate his first meal from the garden in June. A bowl of boiled new potatoes, small and firm and golden, with a handful of young kale leaves wilted in the pot water. He ate it sitting in the doorway of his home, the evening light pouring into the clearing, the air warm and sweet with the smell of grass and growing things. The potatoes tasted of the earth they had grown in, mineral and clean and dense, with a flavor that no store-bought potato had ever possessed. It was not the best meal he had ever eaten. It was the first meal that had ever truly been his. He did not know it then, but he was being watched. The black car appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Rowan was in the garden on his knees pulling weeds from between the bean rows when he heard the sound. Not Dutch's familiar rattling truck. Something different. A smooth, quiet engine, the kind that costs more than most people's houses, purring up the dirt road with the careful, measured pace of a predator approaching open ground. He stood up. His hands were dirty, his jeans were stained with soil, and the shovel was leaning against the mound 3 steps away. He did not reach for it. He did not need to. The car was black, long, spotless, and so profoundly out of place on the dirt road that it looked like a special effect, something digitally inserted into a scene where it did not belong. It rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, and the engine died, and for a moment there was no sound but the wind in the trees and the distant hammer of a woodpecker. The driver's door opened. A man got out. Mr. Pryor was exactly what Rowan had imagined, and nothing like what he had expected. He was tall, mid-50s, with silver hair combed back from a tanned, angular face that had the artificial smoothnesses of someone who spent money to look younger than he was. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored so precisely that it seemed to have been grown onto his body rather than worn. His shoes were black, polished to a mirror finish, and they sank immediately into the soft earth of the clearing, mud closing around them like a slow brown mouth. Pryor looked down at his shoes. He looked up at the clearing, and his face, which had been set in an expression of professional confidence, shifted. The confidence did not leave exactly, but something moved behind it. Confusion. The kind of confusion that comes when reality does not match the map. He was looking for a Quonset hut. He was looking for 40 feet of corrugated steel rusted orange sitting in the middle of a clearing like a target. He was looking for the weak point, the leverage, the thing he could point to and say, this is what you are fighting for, this rusting shed, this nothing. He did not see it. He saw a clearing. He saw a meadow green and wild rolling gently up to a natural-looking hill covered in thick grass. He saw a small garden, well-tended, its rows straight and green. He saw a few chickens, Rhode Island Reds that Rowan had acquired from a farm supply store in town, scratching in the dirt near a small coop he had built from scrap lumber. He saw a stovepipe rising from the top of the hill, which could have been anything, a vent, a remnant, a curiosity. And he saw a young man standing by the garden, covered in dirt, holding nothing, needing nothing, watching him with the calm, steady gaze of someone who was standing on his own ground. Pryor walked toward him. His steps were careful, picking through the grass, trying to save the shoes. It was a losing battle, and Rowan watched it without sympathy. "Mr. Mercer," Pryor said. His voice was the same as on the phone, smooth and warm and hollow. But in person, standing in the clearing, it sounded different. It sounded smaller. The trees and the sky and the open space absorbed it, diluted it, reduced it to what it actually was. Just a voice. Just a man. "I wanted to come out personally." Pryor continued to see the property and to reiterate our offer in person. "We have increased it again substantially. I think you will find the numbers very persuasive." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Cream-colored. Green leaf logo. He held it out. Rowan did not take it. There was a silence. Not the awkward silence of a social miscalculation, but the vast, patient silence of the land itself, the silence that Rowan had learned to live inside, the silence that had become his native language. It pressed against Pryor from every direction, and the man, for all his training, for all his polish, did not know what to do with it. Pryor looked around again. "Again." His eyes swept the clearing of the hill, the garden, the chickens searching for the structure. He had come to see the structure. His photograph should have shown the structure that was supposed to be here. And slowly Rowan watched the realization dawn on Pryor's face. Not all at once, not like a light switching on, but gradually, like a man's eyes adjusting to the dark and beginning to see the shape of something he does not want to see. The hut was gone. It was under the hill. It was the hill. And the boy standing in front of him was not a scared, desperate teenager clinging to a rusting shed. He was a man standing on a piece of earth that had swallowed its own secret and was never going to give it up. Pryor put the envelope back in his jacket. "You are making a mistake," he said. His voice had lost its warmth. Underneath the metal showed. Rowan said nothing. He had learned over the winter, over the months of silence and solitude and work, that silence was not the absence of speech. It was a language of its own. And right now it was saying everything that needed to be said. Pryor stood in the clearing for another full minute. His eyes moved from Rowan to the hill to the garden and back, calculating, reassessing, running the numbers in his head against a reality that did not fit his spreadsheet. Then he turned, walked back to his car, his ruined shoes leaving prints in the soft earth, got in, and drove away. The sound of the engine faded down the dirt road and into the trees, and then there was nothing. Just the wind, just the birds, just the chickens scratching in the dirt, just Rowan standing in his garden, the sun on his face, the earth solid beneath his feet. He knew with a certainty that settled into his bones like warmth from a deep fire that Pryor would not come back. Not because Orion had given up. Corporations do not give up. They adjust, they redirect, they find other targets. But this target had disappeared. The thing they wanted to leverage, the visible, vulnerable, documentable structure, no longer existed. There was nothing to photograph, nothing to cite in a legal filing, nothing to point to and call unpermitted or non-compliant. There was only a hill and a garden and a man who could not be bought because he already had everything he needed. But Orion did try once more. Not Pryor, not a phone call, something colder, more institutional. The county notice arrived 3 weeks later. An official document stamped and sealed informing Rowan that a complaint had been filed and alleging the presence of an unpermitted structure on his property. An inspection had been scheduled. A representative from the county building department would visit the property on a specified date to assess compliance with local zoning and construction codes. Rowan read the notice twice. His hands did not shake. His heart did not race. He had been expecting this. His grandfather's notebook, those careful pages of measurements and diagrams and legal references, had prepared him. Henry Mercer had not just designed a home. He had designed a defense. The inspector came on a Thursday morning in August. He was a middle-aged man named Harlan, with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and the resigned, slightly bored expression of a county employee who had been sent to the middle of nowhere to look at a complaint he suspected was frivolous. He drove a white county truck with a faded seal on the door, and he parked it in the clearing and got out and looked around with the expression of someone who has arrived at the wrong address. Rowan met him at the edge of the garden. He was polite. He was calm. He offered coffee, which Harlan declined, and then he walked the inspector around the property. They walked the perimeter of the clearing. They walked along the tree line. They walked up the gentle slope of the grass-covered hill, their boots sinking slightly into the thick sod, the ground springy and solid beneath them. Harlan looked at his clipboard, at the complaint, at the description of the alleged structure, and then at the landscape around him. The complaint says there is a Quonset hut on this property, Harlan said. Corrugated steel, approximately 40 feet in length. Rowan nodded toward the front of the hill where the door and two small windows were set into what appeared to be a reinforced earth bank, a modest opening in the hillside, a root cellar perhaps, an agricultural storage space, the kind of thing you would find on any rural property in the foothills, so common and unremarkable that no one would think twice about it. That is my root cellar, Rowan said, storage for tools and supplies. Harlan walked to the entrance. He looked at the door, which was steel, yes, but set into an earthen frame that looked as natural as the hillside around it. He looked at the two small windows, half obscured by the grass growing down from the mound above. He looked at the stovepipe emerging from the top of the hill, which Rowan had fitted with a simple cap that made it look like a ventilation pipe, the kind used in underground storage facilities across the rural West. Harlan made a note on his clipboard. He walked around the mound one more time. He stood on top of it, his weight supported by 2 feet of packed earth and the steel arch beneath, though he did not know that and could not have known it. The grass was thick and green and uniform, indistinguishable from the rest of the hillside. Nothing about it suggested that beneath it was a 40-foot steel structure, braced with timber posts insulated by the earth itself, heated by a cast-iron stove, and inhabited by a young man who had moved a small mountain with his bare hands to make it invisible. Henry Mercer had not designed a house. He had designed a disappearance, and the genius of it was not in the engineering, though the engineering was sound. The genius was in the legal framework. An earth-sheltered agricultural storage structure in a rural agricultural zone required no building permit. It was classified the same as a root cellar, a storm shelter, a livestock feed bunker. It was by the letter of the law, not a dwelling. It was a feature of the land, and features of the land do not require inspections. Harlan clicked his pen. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the hill one final time. I do not see a Quonset hut, he said. I see a root cellar and an agricultural storage area, both consistent with the zoning for this parcel. I will note the complaint is unfounded. He tore a yellow copy from his clipboard and handed it to Rowan. Someone does not like you very much, Harlan said. It was not a question, and he did not wait for an answer. He got in his truck, backed carefully down the dirt road, and drove away. Rowan stood in the clearing holding the yellow paper. The wind moved through the grass on the mound, bending it in slow waves, and for a moment the whole hill seemed to breathe. He looked down at the paper. Complaint unfounded. No violation. Case closed. He had won. Not with lawyers, not with money, not with a dramatic courtroom revelation. He had won the way his grandfather had intended him to win, by disappearing, by becoming part of the land, by building something so deeply embedded in the earth that it could not be found, could not be seized, could not be taken. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket next to the iron key he still carried every day, and he went back to his garden. The seasons turned. Summer ripened into autumn. The garden yielded more than he had dared to hope. Bushels of potatoes buried in straw and stored in the cool back of the shelter. Jars of canned beans and pickled squash lined up on shelves he had built along the curved interior wall. Kale dried and stored. Carrots packed in sand in wooden crates. He learned to can and preserve with the same slow, methodical patience that had taught him to dig and haul and lay sod. Each jar was a small victory. Each crate of vegetables was a month of winter that would not defeat him. The chickens produced eggs brown and warm collected each morning from the nesting boxes in the small coop. He traded a dozen eggs each week to Dutch for things he could not grow or make himself: salt cooking oil, kerosene, small necessities that kept the machine of daily life running. It was not money. It was older than money. It was the economy of neighbors, the unspoken contract between people who live close to the land and understand that survival is not a solo act, even when you do most of it alone. Dutch came by less often now, but when he did, the visits had changed. They were no longer the cautious, circling encounters of strangers. They were the quiet, comfortable silences of two men who did not need to speak to communicate. They would sit on the bench Rowan had built outside the door, 2 tin cups of coffee between them, and watch the light move across the meadow. And sometimes Dutch would say a thing or two about the weather or the deer population or the price of feed in town, and sometimes he would say nothing at all, and both were fine. One evening in October, a full year since Rowan had first arrived, Dutch was sitting on the bench when he said without preamble, "Henry would have been proud of you." It was the most the old man had ever said about it. 5 words, but they hit Rowan with a force that no amount of Pryor's smooth persuasion had ever achieved. He did not respond. He did not need to. He sat with the words and let them settle into the place where all the important things were kept. The deep, quiet place that the work and the solitude in the land had built inside him over the past 12 months. 5 years passed. They did not pass quickly. Time in the hills does not work the way it works in the city, where days blur together in a rush of noise and obligation. In the hills, each day has weight. Each season has texture. You feel the year turn physically in your body, in the angle of the sun, in the temperature of the water, from the well, in the length of the shadows on the meadow at 4 in the afternoon. Rowan was 23 now. The boy who had stood on the steps of North Ridge with a duffel bag and hollow eyes was gone, not erased but absorbed, integrated the way a scar is absorbed into the body. He was still there, that boy, in the way Rowan carried himself, in the quiet watchfulness, in the reflexive self-sufficiency. But he was no longer the whole story. He was the first chapter of a longer, harder, more beautiful book. The shelter had become unmistakably a home. The interior, once a cold, echoing cavern of steel and concrete, was now warm and lived in, its curved walls lined with shelves of books and bears and tools, the concrete floor softened with woven rugs he had made from scrap fabric. The wood stove, which had saved his life that first winter, sat in its corner like a faithful companion, its iron sides blackened by years of use, its warmth a constant, dependable presence. A kerosene lamp hung from a hook above the workbench, casting a golden light that softened the metal walls into something almost tender. Dutch had helped him install a small solar panel system the previous summer. 2 panels on a south-facing frame, angled to catch the maximum sun. A battery bank, second-hand, bought from a surplus store in town. Enough power for 2 LED lights, a small radio, and to charge the phone he rarely used. It was not luxury. It was sufficiency. It was exactly enough. The garden had expanded each year, pushing outward from the original plot into new ground he cleared and tilled each spring. He grew more than he could eat now and traded the surplus in town potatoes and squash and kale and eggs for the things the land could not provide. He had become, without intending, to a small but functioning part of the local economy. The woman at the hardware store knew his name. The man at the feed store saved him the good-laying mash. He was no longer invisible. He was Rowan Mercer, the young man on the old Mercer place up in the hills, the one who grew those good potatoes. It was not fame. It was not recognition. It was something better. It was belonging. The sod on the roof was thick and lush now. 5 years of growth knitting it into a dense, permanent mat of grass and wildflower that was indistinguishable from the rest of the hillside. In spring, it bloomed with purple asters and yellow buttercups. In summer, it hummed with bees. In autumn, it turned gold. In winter, it held the snow in a smooth white blanket that insulated the home beneath like a down comforter. The shelter maintained a steady 55 degrees, year-round cool in the summer heat, warm enough in winter that the stove only needed to bring it up another 15 or 20 degrees to be comfortable. Rowan had never become the man Mr. Whitfield had expected. He had not sold the land. He had not taken Orion's money. He had not enrolled in community college or gotten a job or rented an apartment in the city. He had not become normal. He had become something else, something that the system he had grown up in had no category for. No file, no case number, no checkbox. He had become a man who knew the weight of a shovel and the patience of a seed. A man who could read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds. A man who could feed himself from the ground beneath his feet and heat his home with the trees that grew on his own land. A man who needed almost nothing and had almost everything. The letter from his grandfather was still pinned to the wall above the workbench. The paper was soft now, translucent, with handling the handwriting faded but still legible. He did not read it anymore. He did not need to. He knew every word by heart, but he kept it there in the place of honor because it was the beginning of everything. The first word of the story he had written with his own hands. Some evenings when the work was done and the stove was lit and the radio played low in the corner, he would sit in the doorway and watch the sun go down behind the ridge. The light waver come through the trees in long golden shafts, painting the meadow in colors that had no names, and the shadows would lengthen across the grass, and the air would cool and thicken with the smell of pine and earth and wood smoke, and the silence would settle over the clearing like a blanket drawn up to the chin. In those moments, he did not see a lonely patch of dirt in the middle of nowhere. He saw a kingdom. He saw a sanctuary. He saw the legacy of a man's love laid out across 5 acres of forest and meadow and one grass-covered hill that held a secret only the earth knew. The scars were still there. They would always be there. The years in the system, the loneliness, the abandonment that turned out not to be abandonment at all, but the most painful kind of love. They were part of him, the way the cracks in the concrete floor were part of the hut lines of fracture that told the story of what the structure had endured, but not where it had to remain. He thought about Henry Mercer often, not with the raw, anguished grief of that first night by the fire, but with a quieter, deeper feeling that was closer to conversation than mourning. He imagined the old man here in the same doorway, watching the same sunset, planting the same garden, knowing that one day a boy he could not raise would stand in this exact spot and choose to stay. The faith that required was staggering. The love that required was beyond anything Rowan had ever been taught to expect from the world. But here he was, standing where Henry had stood, growing what Henry had planted, keeping the promise that Henry had written in a letter and sealed in an envelope and left in a box for 18 years. This home was not just dirt and steel. It was not just a clever piece of engineering designed to disappear into a hillside. It was a covenant, a handshake across death, a conversation between a grandfather and a grandson that had taken 2 decades to complete, but had said in the end only one thing. You are not alone. You were never alone. I was here the whole time in the soil and the seeds in the walls of this place waiting for you to arrive. Rowan looked out at the clearing. The sun was almost gone, the last thin line of gold balanced on the ridge like a coin on its edge. The chickens were settling into the coop, their soft clucking fading into the quiet. A doe stepped out of the tree line, paused, and bent her head to the grass. The stove ticked behind him as the metal expanded with heat, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, faint, and then bright one by one as if someone were lighting them by hand. He had been given nothing, a key, a shed, a letter from a ghost, and from that nothing he had built everything that mattered, a home that was invisible, a life that was his, a future rooted so deep in the earth that no one, no company, no contract, no smooth-voiced man in a tailored suit could ever pull it out. The door to North Ridge had closed 6 years ago. He could still hear the click if he listened for it, that quiet mechanical sound of the last thread being cut, but it did not hurt anymore. It was just a sound, a door closing. And this, the evening light, the garden, the grass-covered hill with its hidden heart of steel, this was the door opening. He had not been given a home. He had built one. With a shovel and a wheelbarrow and 2 bleeding hands and the stubborn, unreasonable, unbreakable decision to stay. That was the inheritance. Not the land, not the key, not the money in the footlocker. The inheritance was the choice. The choice to dig when every rational voice in the world said run. The choice to plant when every statistic said fail. The choice to stay when staying was the hardest thing he had ever done. His grandfather had known. Somehow, from the other side of death, Henry Mercer had known that the boy in the system, the file in the cabinet, the ghost in the worn hoodie had it in him. Not strength, not skill, not experience, just the willingness to pick up a shovel and begin, and that it turned out was enough. If this story found you the way it found Rowan, if it landed in a place you did not know was empty, then maybe it is because you are building something too. A home, a life, a version of yourself that no one else designed. It does not have to be made of earth and steel. It can be made of courage and patience and the quiet daily decision to keep going. We are all builders, every single one of us. Tell me what you are building. I will be reading every word because we all deserve a place to call our own. And the only person who can build it is you.